Active factions deepen your world building faster than just about anything else in game. They add dynamic human elements to your world that make it feel like a living place instead of just an adventure backdrop. But they can be challenging to craft from whole cloth. I'm RJ Kerr, and in today's Open Table campaign video, I'm going to show you how I craft factions from scratch. Last time, I showed you my technique for building out a city using the modular district method. With that city built, it's time to populate it with people, and that's best accomplished by starting with factions. I'll tackle that in two parts. First, I'll show you what goes into making a playable faction, then I'll show you how I set myself up to track faction actions throughout the game. So without any further ado, let's get started. So the actual process of creating a playable faction is not as complicated as you might imagine. Even though a faction is technically a collection of individuals, maybe tens, hundreds, maybe even thousands of them, it acts as a single entity. Now, of course, there are situations in which you might have one member of the faction acting against the overall objectives or creating intrigue, but that's something separate from the faction itself, right? So we can treat the faction as a cohesive organism, as a singular entity, and therefore build it out as one. So to do that, we're going to generate a few key elements that allow us to role play this faction, their motivations and their actions as we move forward in the campaign. So in general, we're creating a description of the faction. We are outlining their agenda and goals. We're talking about their organizational structure and then some connections, outside of themselves to the rest of the world. So for the example that I'm going to be using today, I'm building out the Resolute. They are a faction that existed inside that already exists inside my campaign setting. They existed in the adventure that I previously ran in Sigil, which if you watch the previous video, you'll know is the home base that I've created for this. And so I'm going to go ahead and flesh them out today. So the first thing that we're doing is a description. And this is just broad strokes, general vibe, feel, really just a couple sentences describing this faction and who they are. So in this case, I wrote, the Resolute are an ultra-conservative wing of Torm's faithful and Sigil. They believe duty and camaraderie are the only pure joys in life and take pleasure in following their assignments to the letter. All other forms of pleasure are considered sinful for their potential to supersede duty and therefore are treated as villainous. Regardless, a fair amount of hypocrisy infects their ranks as some members find ways to indulge while maintaining the guise of piety. And so, again, very broad strokes. I'm not trying to get nuanced here, just creating a general caricature of the organization, if you will. Something concrete that I can play and use in-game, and then make more nuanced as the situation calls for when we're actually playing. So, now that I have that kind of general vibe down, I want to outline their agenda. Now, I break agenda up into two pieces, really, and we'll talk about this influence bit in a minute here, but you have their overall agenda. This is what you might call their purpose. This is why the organization exists. What is it? What is the greater outcome they're trying to achieve? This could be things like to rule the world, to cure a disease, to, spread our religious belief, what have you, across the multiverse. It's their big, hairy, audacious goal. It's the thing that once achieved will complete their whole reason for existing. So in this case, I went with the following. The Resolute want to impose a militaristic hierarchy focused on duty and fidelity on the population of Sigil. So the idea being that through might, right, or faith, they want to get everyone in Sigil underneath their particular organization and their belief structure. So obviously there's a bunch of little things that, well, not necessarily little, but smaller things that will need to occur before such a goal can come to fruition. And that's where we get into immediate goals. So immediate goals are the actual actionable things that this faction is trying to do over the course of a campaign. And they may happen on stage with your characters supporting or opposing what the faction's trying to achieve, or they may happen off stage where you have events happening in the background that maybe only tangentially affect the campaign that your characters are experiencing. Or maybe it's happening in the background and it's queuing them up to interact with in the future or what have you. But these are the little bite-size objectives that the that the faction is pursuing in pursuit of their larger agenda. So in this case, I outlined 3 of them, and I don't like to have more than 3 at a given time. Over the course of a campaign, a single faction can have dozens of these objectives, but I don't like to have any more than 3 that are active. And so, as they become inactive, they'll still be on this list, but I'll cross them out. And I'll add new ones to this immediate goals list because these are the 3 things that they're trying to do right then and there. Too many things becomes unwieldy to manage and frankly becomes unrealistic for the faction to be trying to put any kind of significant resources into. At the very minimum, significant enough that the characters would notice outside of being directly involved in a particular goal. So when I write these, I give myself just a little, bullet point of what it is. I grade it with a difficulty, so easy, medium, or difficult. And that will be important later when I talk about setting myself up for success for tracking these faction actions and faction goals when they're happening in the background off screen. But again, I'm keeping these very simple. I'm writing a little sentence of detail for myself. So, for example, in the adventure that I ran as part of my ongoing campaign, the characters ended up, they ended up causing the deaths of the leadership of the Resolute. Specifically, their true leader, Harlow Threst, and their patron, High Hand Peleg Gao. And that was over the course of their decisions. They came into conflict with Harlow as part of the adventure, but they went and sought out Peleg because they hated Harlow. So now we have a faction that is without a leader. And so their first goal, a relatively easy one in comparison to the others, is to select a new leader. Then afterwards, they're going to want to infiltrate their opposition, and we'll talk about allies and enemies in a bit here. But there's a faction in my version of Sigil called the Inkblot Angels, and they are headed by a solar named Pamiel, who does not get along with the Resolute. So they're going to want to infiltrate Pamiel's organization, and then vengeance. They're going to want to assassinate Pamiel because they blame the Inkblot Angels for what happened to their leadership, since the party was affiliated with them at the time. So, again, you're just very bite-sized, very actionable goals here. You should be a good sort of litmus test for this is if it can be answered with a yes or no, right? So, the Resolute wants to select a new leader following the deaths of their leadership. Okay, well, have they? Yes or no? Well, if we can answer that with a yes or no, then it's probably bite-sized enough for what we're talking about here. If there's any kind of nuance to it, then we probably want to break it up into multiple segments. Now, that doesn't mean that it's a flip of a coin in terms of its simplicity, but we'll talk about that more when we get to tracking the events. Likewise, factions are of various sizes and have various levels of influence. I used to try to track how physically large, like numbers of membership that a faction might have, but one, that became cumbersome, and two, it really only roughly translated to anything that I would actually use in game. And I found it much better to start tracking the kind of influence that a faction has. And I've used a number of tools over the years to kind of figure that out. And I've settled on this minor, medium, and major, meaning that, a faction of minor influence has, well, less influence than one of medium influence or one of major influence. And that has also allowed me to set up certain die and DC associated with these various factions. With these things, like a minor is a 1d8, a medium is 1d6, and a major is a 1d4, and I use that die to determine how successful they are when they're trying to achieve segments of these various goals. So again, I'll talk about that more as we get farther along in this, when we get to the factions actually taking faction actions and pursuing their own goals. But I also like to have a find agent DC, and that means that you may end up with a faction where the characters go looking for them before the faction comes looking for the characters. And so if it's a small faction, they're going to be harder to find somebody who's willing to talk to them. Likewise, medium faction will be of average difficulty, and a major faction will be easier to find people because, one, there will be more of them, and two, there's more people who can actually take action and interact with the characters. They have more influence. So what I do is, to set this DC, it's just 8 plus whatever the die max is. So the maximum on 8-sided die is 8, so 8 plus 8 is 16. Medium is 8 plus 6, so 14, and major is 8 plus 4, so 12. And I really only use this DC when the characters are going to look for a point of contact within a faction that they don't have any contact with previously. They're irrelevant if the players can already know somebody involved in that faction, unless they need to go seek a new contact. But again, we'll get back into that once we get into faction actions and pursuing goals. Likewise, the organization structure is really, for the most part, it's less about actual ranks and the internal flow chart of who answers to who. Really, you have 3 broad categories that the characters you're going to interact with, and the first is, shouldn't say the first that they're going to interact with. The highest tier that they're going to interact with is the organization's leader. Who is in charge, or what entity is in charge, or what body is in charge. So in this case, since I am in a unique circumstance where the Resolute are currently without leadership, I created 3 potentials for the players to encounter as they adventure, should they choose to engage with the Resolute at all. But normally I would have one ruling council, or I would have, one governmental body, or I would narrow it down to a single group, a single cohesive group, or a single executive officer, like a king or a guild master or what have you. But this is a unique circumstance, so I've created 3 potentials, and as the characters interact with them, that may choose who becomes the leadership, or it may come down to faction actions. So, I, again, just gave them a name. I gave them a stat block, since there's the possibility that they may fight with our characters at a certain point. And I gave them a funny hat and a little line of personality description. So, Jedediah Sooth is a young man with a face like still water, and he has a violent streak that he shrouds inside a stony piety. And so it's little bits of information like that, because again, I don't even know if the characters are going to interact with these people. I just want to have this information on tap in case they do, in case they go looking for the boss, as it were, in case they ask for the manager. And so you just need a little bit of information for the various members, unless they become really influential in the game. So, for example, if my party was to really dig into the Resolute and decide that this is an organization that they are either very much for, or more likely, knowing my players, very much against, and which is frankly the intention. They're not supposed to be a very nice group. But the but in that case, if they're having a lot of interaction with the leader, then I will take the time between sessions and really kind of flesh them out into a fully rendered NPC, which is something we're going to talk about in the next installment of this open table campaign prep video series. But in the meantime, I'm just going to give myself the minimum. Are you a forever DM looking for a reprieve, or a player wanting to get into the game? Then join my table at startplaying.games. Whether you want a one-shot, a published adventure, or a campaign written just for you, I've got games for everyone. Check out my available tables at startplaying.games/GM/RJ Kerr. Thanks for listening. Now back to our video. Now, the agents. These are for lack of a better term, they're the point of contacts. These are the people that the characters are most likely to actually interact with. That being said, again, I'm not going to put any more than 2 or 3 sentences of info into them until the characters start interacting with them and seem as though they intend to continue interacting with them. So in this case, I took a minor character who was a member of the Resolute in the adventure that I previously ran, and just made her the agent, the point of contact, the one that will either reach out to the characters if, for whatever reason, the Resolute wants to make contact with them, or the characters can track down if, for whatever reason, they want to make contact with the Resolute. And again, I just did these 2 sentences here. Lily Haven, female human, war priest with shining golden braids. There's her funny hat and her stat block. And she holds piety above all other virtues, but is a sucker for flattery. And so we have a little role-playing element there, and handily a little lever that the characters can use to try to manipulate her, since she's somebody they're likely going to interact with when they interact with this faction at all. So action groups are more of a combat encounter on the fly kind of prep thing. And so you don't need too many of these, but what this is it's effectively a response team. So when you're making these factions, there's always the possibility that your characters are going to decide that they're going to take they're going to zig when you thought they were going to zag. They're going to go left when you thought they were going to go right. And maybe they, bust into, a meeting of the Resolute, or they break into one of their bases, or they do something that otherwise would inspire vengeance from this faction. Well, I want to know who is going to respond to that, who shows up. And it's unlikely to be their agent, although maybe it is. Maybe she leads this group. But it's also more likely to involve a number of people. And so I just create 1 or 2 of these action groups that are the most likely composition. So they bust into to a secret meeting in the Resolute, and a fight's going to break out, and I didn't expect for that to happen. I can already say, all right, well, there's a champion, 2 priests, and 6 knights that jump up, grab weapons, and jump into the fray. So I have a convenient block of NPCs already put together. Now, I don't worry about balancing this for the character's level. I just build something that is, moderately in the ballpark, knowing that, if they are too low, well, they're going to have to run away. If they're too high, well, they're going to, kick butt and take names. So, I really just make this kind of a ballpark unit that's very sort of kinda in their tier of difficulty, and that it seems reasonable and realistic. A team of 9 seemed like a good action group for characters of 13th, 14th level to butt up against if they were to have a random encounter, if you will, with this organization. So that's all that we're putting into the organizational structure. Now, if this is a faction that your characters might seek to join, for example, Forgotten Realms setting has things like, the Order of the Gauntlet, the Emerald Enclave. Well, then you might spend time building out ranks and actually working on that flow chart of the hierarchy. But again, you don't need to do that until your players show interest in their characters joining that particular faction. Don't do more work than you have to, because wasted effort on that scale is not going to enrich the lore of your world in any really tangible way. It's just going to be time that you wasted that you could have been spending on something that really would deepen the experience for the players. So don't feel like you need to fill out everything ahead of time, just the stuff that's necessary to get it on the table and in the game, and you can let everything else blossom in between sessions. Now, connections are all about the faction's relationship mostly to other factions. So in the context of this example, there are 3 other factions that exist in this world that the Resolute have relationships with, either as allies or enemies of, and even though there's tons of other factions, the Resolute are, for the most part, pretty indifferent to most of them, and therefore they don't need to be listed here. So the first one are the Lamplighters, which I spoke about in the previous video. All right. And so for each faction, I'm going to add them to this factions table that I built out here. And we'll talk more about what goes in that table in a minute here. But each faction gets a page just like this in this Notion document. So the Lamplighters are an ally of the Resolute. Then we have, as we mentioned before, the Inkblot Angels. Okay. And they are very much the primary enemy of the Resolute. And then there is Moloch. Now, for those of you familiar with some D&D lore, Moloch is an archdevil banished from the Nine Hells who lives in Sigil. And he, although an entity by himself, an individual, is, frankly, in my mind, a faction as well, right? Think about like Batman and DC Comics, right? We don't talk about the Joker belonging to a faction, but the Joker has agents. The Joker has, sidekicks and has henchmen, and we think of them as the Joker's men. Same kind of thing for, the Penguin or any of the big villains in there, where you have one iconic figure at the head of the faction, and that becomes both the faction's name and the name of the leader. And so that happens sometimes. And in this case, Moloch is one of those. So he is an additional faction that is not too fond of the Resolute. So I'm not putting any detail about those factions here because I will build them out later in their own faction page. I'm just cross-referencing them here so that when I'm dealing with the Resolute and the party runs into an agent from Moloch, well, I know that that's somebody who might be incentivized to help the party oppose the Resolute, or vice versa. So that's really all there is in terms of making an actual playable faction. What comes next is how we set ourselves up so that this faction can take actions in the campaign, both on and off stage, on and off screen, and how we're going to keep track of that so we don't completely forget about it. So the first thing that I'm going to do for that is I'm going to come back to this influence. Now, when I'm filling this out normally for myself, I don't put all 3 influence options here. This is really for educational purposes, if you will. But I'm going to choose one of these options as the level of influence this faction has. So in this case, we're going to say it's medium. And so it's that, so medium influence, meaning it has the 1d6 action die, we'll talk about that real quick, and then the find agent DC of 14. So that 1d6 comes into play whenever the faction is trying to achieve an objective off screen, right? So, let's say the party is off somewhere else right now. In fact, they are. They're currently in the Feywild. And so meanwhile, the Resolute are trying to select a new leader. Now, I've said that this is an easy goal, which means that I'm going to be assigning a easy progress clock to this. Same for Infiltrate being a medium and Vengeance being a difficult goal, right? And when they are trying to achieve sections of that, I roll a 1d6, and on a roll of 1, they succeed, and they color in one of the wedges. They fill in one of the components. You'll see, kind of by looking at this, that means that factions of minor influence are going to achieve their goals less often or less frequently, on average, than factions of medium influence, who will also achieve their goals less frequently than factions of major influence. And again, these die rolls are just when these actions are, this movement towards their goals is taken off screen. If the characters are actually interacting with that, then that's all determined on the table, just like you determine anything else in live play, in real play, where the characters are making decisions and the factions responding to those, and everybody making checks and rolls and what have you, and role playing their way through it. That always takes precedence over these checks. These are just for stuff's going on in the background that the players aren't involved with, and how do I know how quickly it moves forward or doesn't move forward, or if it gets stalled or what have you. So let's really demonstrate that with an example. And we're going to do that by building out some progress clocks for these goals. So what I do for that is I come up to my headers here within Notion, and for influence, I'm going to go ahead and pick medium there so that it populates on my table here. But I'm also going to build 3 new properties. And the first one is going to be called, the first one's going to be a number type here. And it's going to be called an easy clock. And we're going to make that a ring. And it's going to be divided into 4 segments. Okay. Next, I want that up top. Next, I'm going to do the same kind of thing, but I'm going to create a medium clock. Again, a ring. We're going to divide this one into 6 segments. And last, again, a number. And we're going to give ourselves a difficult clock. All right, ring. And this one is going to be 8 segments. Okay, so what's going to happen is that when the faction takes an action and they attempt to move closer to one of their immediate goals, off screen, we roll the die and they get a result of 1. Well, then this wedge, one of those gets filled in. And so now you can see we are a quarter of our way there. And so we're going to do this with every period of downtime, and that's kind of a loose amount of time. It really just depends on the pace of your campaign. But when this is completely full up, it means that they were successful. They've achieved their goal and they've selected a leader. Now, the players can get involved. They can knock it back. They could advance, one of these wedges. Doesn't really matter. But this is giving me a clear, sort of a clear visual aid of how close they are to completing a certain objective. And by having it, right up here, we're going to move that bad boy back to the other side there. It makes it really easy for me to kind of see at a glance how they're progressing on their various goals. Now, I also want to keep track of what those goals are, right? And because I might have many goals for many factions going at once. And so I do that with the background events, Kaban, board kind of deal here where I've got 3 columns: not started, in progress, and done. And so what I'm doing is I am just taking the description and I am opening up a card here, making that description the title, and we'll just cut it down so it's just a little bit easier. And I'm adding a couple properties. I like to add a select, and we're going to call this outcome, and we're going to add success, change that to green, and then we're going to add fail and change that to red. Okay. Right. And then just to keep things clear, I will also hit a multi-select and I will say organization. So who are they connected to? I don't always say faction at this particular place just because sometimes I will end up with individuals, particularly influential individuals who are doing things in the background that I'll keep track of. But this is just kind of my comprehensive background event tracker. But again, then I'll put one here for the name of the faction, so the Resolute. Okay. And then I will, actually I do want it that way. I'll mark them here, and I don't have an outcome yet because it's still in progress. They're looking for a new leader. All right. And just to make things easier for myself, I'll go to the properties here and I'll have organization and outcome shown, right? So as an event triggers, I will move it into progress, and then as it finishes up its progress clock, it'll go to done, and it was either a success or a failure. In the case of failure, there's some things that if they get knocked all the way back, I might say, hey, the faction gives up on that particular attempt. Now they're going to switch to a new objective. Very loose in terms of when they quit. It's really up to you. But this helps me track what's worked and what hasn't for them. And so I'll do that for all of the goals that they have. And we're just doing that for all of these cards. Now, you'll notice that I keep this one as not started because I know it's going to happen, but the Resolute isn't in a place to do that yet. They're still trying to get a leader put in there. Now, with other faction actions, they might, attempt several of them at a time. So they might have several kind of fingers in various pies, several pots cooking, if you will. And so you may have several things in this in progress area here resolving themselves at various speeds. But never more than 3. 1 easy, 1 medium, and 1 difficult is kind of my, my Goldilocks recipe for what seems to be just right for it to feel dynamic and realistic without being so unwieldy that I struggle to play it. And that is really all that there is to developing dynamic playable factions that you can use in your campaign settings, whether they're open table or campaigns or your more typical narrative campaigns. So I hope you found this useful. If you have any questions, please drop them in the comments. I'd love to hear from you guys. If you've enjoyed this video, please like, subscribe, and hit that bell icon so that you never miss a video. And if you like my content and you would like to play in one of my campaigns, come find me on startplaying.games/GM/RJ Kerr, spelled just like my name, right here on YouTube. Thank you so much, and I look forward to seeing you here in the future and hopefully meeting you at one of my tables.